Welcome to the Scottish Basketball Podcast. We post weekly episodes on the senior game in Scotland. You can join for free on Patreon and Spotify to receive a notification when new episodes are released. Search for the Scottish Basketball Podcast. I am delighted to be joined on the second episode of 4 of this History of Basketball in Scotland series, the Cumnock Chronicles, by Allan Turner, to talk about the story of the Cumnock Basketball Club. In this episode, I chat with Allan about how the club recovered from their first foray into Division 1 through seasons 1979 to 1983. Delighted to welcome Allan to the podcast. Hi, Allan.
Hi there. How you doing, Andrew? Glad to be here.
After the disaster of Mark and Jimmy disappearing mid-season in 78-79, you're back for the 79-80 season, undeterred and straight back on the phone recruiting some new Americans. Your wife Anne's off to the airport with no photo or description. Currys have increased their sponsorship, and the central garage sorts you out an automatic car when the players can't drive manual. How did you approach recruiting Americans the second time round, and what made you confident Steve and Dick would work out better?
The person who was getting the Americans for us was a chap called Stuart Wilson, who had managed. He had lots of American contacts and had got American players for other teams in Scotland. So we kind of trusted him to try and get us a standard of college American that would do for us. And it was Stuart who actually got us the contact, and it was him that made contact that was able to do that. And that's when Dick and Steve arrived at the airport, where we were all working, and my wife had to go and collect Steve and Dick at the airport with no photograph. And all she knew was that there was a guy that was 6'9" and a guy that looked like an American basketballer with white, shiny teeth. And she managed to find these boys quite quickly in the airport. So that worked out quite well.
Dick Rockwood comes alive in the league for you. He's an exceptional shooter who teaches you your own offense and becomes your most prolific scorer. This season, you also compete in an international tournament in Dublin for the first time, mixing with Britain's biggest teams. You have an issue when the Americans start comparing salaries. Talk us through that unravelling from the early season promise to finishing a disappointing fifth.
What I would say is that the biggest tournament, and the Roy Curtis tournament was big for everybody concerned. It was early in the year. Steve and Dick could really show off their talents there, and I think they felt quite good about themselves because they did well in that tournament with other Americans of similar ability. So that was a really good starting point for them. Steve actually started, but Steve started brilliantly. He was scoring 40 points a game when we went down to Manchester in a pre-season tournament. Dick was a bit rusty, but we couldn't quite sure. We thought that Steve was going to be the star and that Dick was just going to kind of pal. But in actual fact, as that tournament went on, Steve came off the boil and Dick Rockwood just proved himself such a prolific shooter. It was just amazing. And then that continued throughout the whole year. His stats for the whole year, for that year that he was in basketball, he was one of the top shooters in the country at that time. Motivating Americans who think they are worth more than they are becomes a bit of a trend for us. The usual referee frustration and losses to the big money Americans start to hurt. Their ego starts to take a wee fall. Sometimes they think we should be doing more for them, but in actual fact, we are doing more than we possibly can. So what happens is we speak to Jim Wilcox, and Jim decides he can get them more money, but they have to come and work at the factory. So they do that, but initially they're hauling crates, and the boys don't like it. I mean, it's hard work because you don't get something for nothing once you start doing the job thing. They believe this is affecting their shooting, so that job stops. And then Jim Wilcox is trying to help us all the time. So he puts them on some kind of gardening thing, so it's not just quite so heavy for them, like tidying up around the factory and stuff. But to be fair, the guys just want to play basketball. They don't want to work. So they eventually make the decision that they don't want to work, and they'll just make do with what they have. However, that's a deteriorating cycle of, I don't know if I can work as hard as you need me to work when I think I should get paid more. However, we did get them to attend. They used to attend lunchtime practices every day at Cumnock. So that breached the gap of them not being sharp, because then they were training every day at lunchtime. And they were also, while they were doing that at Cumnock, they were actually getting to know some of our schoolboy players who were in with them every day at lunchtime. Now, that really caused a big buzz in Cumnock Academy. When everybody in the school knew these American players were down training with the school team, and there was crowds of people at the doorways watching these guys train. What I would say is that Jim Morrison actually got to know Steve really well. They take Jim under their wing. They tried to make him a better player, and then Steve Nichols organised for Jim to go to LA with him the following summer to go to a camp where he actually met Magic Johnson at that camp. So that was a big kind of situation where Jim was able to gain a lot from these Americans who took him to America to a training camp. That was great. At the end of the season, Jim Morrison told me this story at the end of the season, right? And I couldn't believe Jim held this story off me until the boys were way back home. He said, "You know, Alan, Steve told me that he kind of given up a wee bit because of the circumstances. Steve was to let Jim know if he wanted to play hard that day, and he would just play harder." That's absolutely incredible. So in other words, they'd kind of switched off, but they said if Jim Morrison had wanted them to play harder, they would play harder. So that was a wee bit a downer. Jim didn't tell me that till later, so I couldn't do anything about it. Season 79-80, we only have a mid-finish, which in some ways was a wee bit disappointing. I think it was because of the slide off at the end. You with me? If you don't play for the whole season, the guys kind of gave up a wee bit and we lost a bit. But I'll tell you this: even though we had a mid-season finish, we actually got noticed big time that year. Rockwood and Nichols were both in the top scorers list that year. They came off. I think they came off the boil, and they were still in the top scorers list. Campbell and Rockwood and Nichols were in the top free throw rankings, and Dick Rockwood had a 50-point and a 40-point high-scoring game. So even though we finished mid, people started to say, "Cumnock guys are coming on. Have you seen these Americans this year? They've got some solid Americans." So I think we improved in status that year, even though we may not have improved in the league position.
1980-81 season, you're back in Division 1. Your Americans fly in. Jerry Simpson flies in from the States. Frank Konstantinovich travels up from England. Mel Capaldi, an ex-GB point guard, moves from Edinburgh to work in Glasgow, and he chooses to play for you in Cumnock. He's one of the few players who join you from a bigger club. Graham Hill arrives on the scene in this year. The Ayrshire Schools development is starting to pay dividends. What's it like that season in 80-81, having a mix of experienced GB talent alongside your teenage prospects and a couple of the new Americans?
It's a great balance for us. The training was actually fun and it was intense. It was great for me personally to see one of my young proteges coming along at age 16 and fitting in with these senior players. It was great for him, it was great for me, it was great for the team. Mel Capaldi had a lot of Boroughmuir stories and Boroughmuir traits that were very good for basketball that he brought to Cumnock. I don't think we valued that as much as we could have or should have. But as I say, Mel's stories alone, they were worth the price of admission. And all our youngsters lapped up all his stories about basketball that they then wanted to emulate, especially with regard to Boroughmuir, who were our high-flying predecessors.
Unfortunately, disaster strikes for Jerry. He breaks his leg in a game early in the season, and it's the first serious American injury that you've had to deal with. And you send him home. Fortunately, he doesn't want to make any big deal or claim against the club.
No.
The contact of Frank, your other American, brings in Jimmy Graziano, who's big centre. Again, similar as you mentioned before, his performance tails off when he discovers maybe what some of the other guys in the league are earning. You have a few player run-ins about not giving 100%. You cope until the end of the season. How did you navigate this season with that injury crisis and the pay dispute? And yet you still finished third, so it was a good overall result.
Having the Jerry incident was really quite we were actually worried that we might have been in some way responsible, but it was just one of those things. It was a freak accident, and Jerry himself was very good about it, and he just travelled back. Frank kept in touch with him, and he kept giving us reports on how he was doing. But Jimmy Graziano, who was I don't know whether he was a friend of Frank, but Frank's contact, I think he was a 6'10" American. He was a big, tall player. But Jimmy, he was another one. See if we could have kept these guys in the Cumnock area without playing games and having them talk to their American pals at the end of games, we might have managed to get through. But every time they spoke to American, they were making, I'm only hazarding a guess here, but they could have been making between 5 or 8 times what our Americans were making. And they got a wee bit paranoid about the fact they thought we were kind of holding out on them. And we were already selling fundraising and selling raffle tickets and doing all sorts of things. And we couldn't afford any more. So it ended up where Jimmy virtually kind of gave up. I wanted to actually send him home. I wanted the club to send him home because he was being so negative. It was actually affecting the whole team. But we didn't have enough money to send him home, and we were going to have to wait and fundraise in order to send him home. So it was quite frustrating. And I spent a lot of time where if Jimmy wasn't going to play the way I needed him to play, I took him off and I sat him down the bench, because that's what coaches do when players aren't doing right well. He got even more huffy, and that was a poor cycle. We didn't really get out the bit in that one. So it was quite frustrating for me. But the team results were quite good because we had good players around Jimmy. So when Jimmy wasn't doing the job, the other players could step up a bit and do some scoring.
The 81-82 season, again, some new Americans arrive. You've got Clyde Glass this year. He's a 6'5" guard. Yeah. And Larry Shelton as power forward, massive dunk. The guys aren't staying in the hotel for the first season. You've got the keys to a rented house. The guys settling well. What made this American pairing work so much better than the previous years? What was their impact in the local community? And how did the pair also help develop your young Scottish talent?
It was just a good team balance. Larry had great athleticism. He could leap and dunk the ball, and he was good to watch. I think our spectator base really increased big time when we got Larry because of his athleticism. We'd never had a 6'5" guard in Clyde Glass, so having a really tall guard in the back court means, and he was a great passer of the ball, Clyde. So we had this great passer and an athletic jumping player who could really play the game. And to be fair, I thought the guys fitted in really well.
Off the court, the fundraising becomes frantic. The club starts selling the Basketball Scotland lottery tickets at the time. It's proven to be a great moneymaker. It is a big operation. The players are selling to family and friends all over Ayrshire. How consuming had the administration and fundraising become by this point, whilst you were all still holding down day jobs?
Well, it just became quite overwhelming, to be fair. And certainly, I think myself and Tommy and Roger, to be fair, were probably carrying the brunt of that. But I didn't notice it at the time because I was too involved. But I think I may have neglected family time and other kind of school time in order to do all the things that we needed to do at the weekend to get a game running. And the fundraising for any club is really hard. For people who are holding down teaching jobs, your whole weekend and your evenings are spent fundraising. So yes, that was tricky, and we just did it because we had to do it, and that was how it operated.
The players this season are solid and last right till the season's end, but they still have the usual Scottish referee problems and foul out with regular consistency. It wears down Larry, especially, who rarely stays calm, and even with some focused substitutions, you never get the best out of him. Despite all that, the club finished in the top 4 in Scotland. Looking back, what did finishing 4th actually mean for the club standing in the wider basketball scene? And with 2 top 4 finishes in a row, did it feel like you had now properly established yourselves at that level?
Yes, I think Cumnock became the young developing club with all the young players who could shoot the ball, play good basketball, and they were always going to be up against bigger teams from bigger centres with more money. I think Basketball Scotland probably felt that we were doing a great job, considering that in the main we were working with our own local players and a couple of Americans who maybe weren't quite as good as the other Americans that other teams could afford to buy in.
1982-83, it doesn't quite click overall this season. You struggle through and finish a respectable 7th. This is the postseason where the big clubs come headhunting your young talent, and as you've alluded to, Cumnock can't really compete financially with them. Graham Hill goes off to Murray for a fee and a show game at the Magnum. Jim Morrison, John Duncan moved to Falkirk. It must have been gutting developing all this talent only to watch them leave. Was it a difficult decision to let them go? Was there anything really you could have done, or would you have done anything differently to get them to stay?
We couldn't keep these guys. It would have been a travesty. We had taken them as far as we could go, and they were doing a great job for us and for Cumnock. But for the boys to improve, they needed to be playing with other Americans at a higher level, with a higher level of professional coaches. And there was no way we were going to hold them back. They were keen to go. They went with our blessing. in the hope that after they had done their stint and they had finished, that they would remember us and come back to us once that time had finished. So that was quite important from that point of view. The good thing for us that we were surviving mostly on our own grown home players anyway, and few clubs in Scotland could do that. So we were quite proud of the fact that we could put ourselves out in a court with nothing but our own club players, finish mid-table, and in some cases kind of play beyond their abilities in order to prove that we were in the right place at the right time.
There was more changes to come in this off-season. David Conker joined Charlie Woods, Jim Smart and Jim Mitchell at Paisley. Roger Stewart retired to focus on his career. Tom Campbell and Bob Taft go to the newly formed Team Glasgow, backed by Davy Coyer's big money. So it's a big moment of change for Cumnock and basketball in Scotland at this point. The sport's going to take a meteoric rise in the next couple of years. More Americans, full-time professionals, both players and coaches, big TV coverage. Murray, Glasgow, Falkirk leading the way, whilst some of the smaller clubs now, like Boroughmuir, Dalkeith, yourselves and Paisley, are still surviving day-to-day on volunteers. You wonder in the notes that you sent me what might have happened if you'd been able to keep that Cumnock unit together for a couple more years. Allan, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
In the next episode, I chat with Allan about how the club adapted to the big money era of Scottish basketball through the bust and boom years of 1983 to 1988. For more episodes on the senior game in Scotland, join and subscribe to the Scottish Basketball Podcast for free on Patreon and Spotify to receive a notification when new episodes are released. Search for the Scottish Basketball Podcast. Thanks for listening.